If you've read anything about the CFA, you know it's an absolute beast, but it's a whole lot easier if you know how to approach it. Hang around and I'll show you. So if you're new to the channel, my name is Harris and I'm an investment associate and CFA charter holder, and I passed all 3 levels first time round, scoring in the 90th percentile at all applicable levels, including level 2. So in today's video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the level and then we'll go through some tips to help me absolutely smash the exam. Let's get into it. Okay, let's start with a level overview. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you would have heard me describe level 1 as introductory in nature. So the concepts are quite simple. You may have come across them if you studied something finance or accounting related, and generally speaking, the exam is quite simple, it's direct, only sort of one cognitive step, so quite easy to smash if you put the time in. Level 2 is a significant step up, both in terms of breadth and depth, so the content is 4 times heavier and it's much more difficult to cram, and generally speaking, you require more like 500 hours versus 300 hours at level 1. So the topics are the same as level 1. I won't rattle through them, I'll just put them on the screen, more importantly to highlight the differences between the weightings. So at level 1 there is more of a leaning, at level 2 they're more evenly distributed, all within the sort of 5 to 15% range, meaning that they could all in theory be 10%, and that makes it more difficult to be strategic, and I'll touch on the implications of that in the tips later in the video. In terms of the exam, you now have 88 multiple choice questions versus 180 at level 1, and they will now follow a vignette style. So there is a passage of information that you have to read, and each passage has around 4 to 6 questions associated with it. So there's a lot more reading and digestion required, which is more time consuming. So exam technique becomes important, and I'll touch on that in the tips later. Generally speaking, the questions are much more applied now. So there will be more cognitive steps, which makes the exam more difficult. And again, I'll touch on that later. Okay, there are 5 tips that I'm going to cover off. And the first one is start early. Now, it's a simple one, not glamorous, but it's very important and I won't spend long on it. But as I emphasized earlier in the video, the content is much deeper and much broader than level 1. So it's going to take you a lot longer to get through. And generally speaking, it's a lot more applied as well. So first, principle thinking becomes important here. You need to understand things intuitively, and for that you need time to digest it, absorb it, and be able to reason. So you're going to need time. If you try and cram it in the last 3 months and do sort of 10 hours a day, you are not going to sufficiently grasp it to be able to apply it effectively, and you risk not passing the exam. So give yourself at least sort of 6 months plus to do this, and it's probably the only level where you need that much time. So yeah, pay attention to that. Okay, so tip number 2 is to start with the hardest topics. Now, there's 2 ways you can approach the curriculum. One is to start with the ones with the highest weighting, and the other is the hardest ones. Now, I wouldn't go with the highest weightings at this level because, as I said, in theory, they could all be 10%. So instead, I'd focus on the hardest topics, which are quant, fixed income, derivatives, and econ. These are the ones that are going to take you the longest to get your head around and to digest. So if you start with them and then work on the others and come back to these later on, it gives you time to work on them in the background, and it will be easier to understand them. I'm going to link you to a video from Mark Meldrum which covers off the optimal study order, and I think this is very beneficial. This is what I used, so have a look at that as well. Now, a point to note on fixed income and derivatives, these can be very techy. There's lots of formulas and derivations, etc., and it's all well and good, and I'll touch on formulas later in the video, but generally, if you find yourself doing a question when it comes to the practice questions that's taking you 15 to 20 minutes to do, you are not going to be required to do that in the exam. So things like CVAs or credit valuation adjustments in fixed income, I think they may have taken it out of the curriculum, but nonetheless, and Black-Scholes-Mertens in derivatives, so on and so forth. These are all well and good. You need to know about them, but you don't need to know how to derive them. So just a point to note there. And this is where a good prep provider is key. If you use the books, you get lost in the details. So watch my first video. I'll link it on the screen or in the description, and that covers off the approach that I used. In terms of the other topics, FRA can also be a bit tough with the pension accounting, etc., and it's quite long, so give yourself some time for that. And then equity is super long, so it's quite easy, but again, factor that in. It's going to take you some time to get through it. So again, I'd probably do it in the middle of the pack, but watch that Mark Meldrum video. Final point, which you would have heard me say in my level 1 video, ethics should be done at the end. It's not intuitive, it's hard to understand per se, so generally it's better to commit it to your short-term memory. So I'd cover it off right at the end, commit it to that short-term memory, and then do the exam. Okay, tip number 3 is understand the formulas. Now, if you've seen the formula sheet for level 2, you'll see that there's like 70 plus formulas, and it can be super overwhelming, and if you try to simply memorize them, it's going to be very difficult. However, if you look at them closely, a number of them are subtle variations of each other, And if you look at them from first principles and derive them, you'll actually be able to remember them all based on a common root. So for example, equity has a lot of this with the dividend discount model, free cash flow evaluation, etc. Most of them are subtle variations of each other. So if you learn the root of them, it's actually a lot easier. Similar thing in derivatives and some of this in portfolio management as well. So I'd watch, again, if you use Mark Meldrum as a prep provider, and I covered it in more detail in my first vid, you should watch the seminars. He goes through the derivations. You don't need to know the derivations, but it's more that you can see the origin of it. And if you learn the origin in the exam, you can quickly get to the one you need. If you try and learn 10 or 15 formulas instead of 1 or 2, it's going to be much more difficult. So try and use the derivation approach, and also keep a separate set of notes for formulas only. So I usually pull them out of the main curriculum, wrote them out on separate sheets, and then sort of kept them isolated so I could review them and look at them without all the text and the details surrounding it. Sometimes that helped me as well. So keep your main notes and have some formula notes on the side as well. Okay, tip number 4 is learning techniques. Now, I touched on it earlier in the video, but for level 2, first principle thinking is critical. It's very much applied in nature. So how do you do that? Well, I employed a few techniques that helped me with this. So firstly, as I was studying the curriculum, I would always make notes of the parts that I struggle with the most. So don't just go through and think, I'll come back to this at another point. Keep a running list on the side, because these are the topics that you need to drill into deeper. So that's an effective way to approach it. And then related to that, I would also make notes of parts of the curriculum that overlap with other parts. This was very important. Often something crops up in one topic and then it's applied in another topic. And by doing this, by establishing these cross connections, you build that sort of holistic understanding, which is critical at level 2, but even more important at level 3. So do those two things. And then in terms of applying it, use the Feynman technique. So you may have heard of this, I touched on it in my study video, but generally the point here is to articulate your learnings either to someone or to put it onto paper. So if you can, grab someone and explain the concept to them. If not, say it out loud and you'll identify the gaps in your knowledge. And otherwise, grab a blank piece of paper and write a summary of a subject or derive a formula or whatever it might be. And this will help you articulate your learnings and identify gaps. Okay, finally, let's cover off tip number 5, which is exam techniques. So there's a few things to note here. And the first one is don't use the mocks for learning, use them for consolidation. So at level 1, some people use the mocks to actually learn the material, and you can kind of do that because the exam is quite direct. So the questions are very simple, they're defined, recall based, etc. But level 2 is much more applied. You're not going to learn the content by doing the mocks. So start with the content and use the mocks for consolidation. Also, level 2 has vignettes, which I touched on earlier in the video, and that means there's a bunch of information you have to digest before you can answer the question. Now, a key thing here is you need to read the question first and then read the passage of information. If you read the information first, you don't actually know what you're looking for, so then you go and read the question, then you go back and read the information again, and that's just waste time. So slow down in the exam and read the question first, then approach the text. You know what you're looking for now, and it's much more effective. A point to note about the presentation: when you're doing the practice questions on the CFA portal, the vignettes can be really long, and also the questions at the bottom of the vignette. It's quite hard then to remember what you just read in the question. In the exam, they're side by side, so you have the vignette on the left and the questions on the right. So it's much easier to read the question and then read the text. So this strategy is very effective in the exam, so don't worry about that. And finally, and I've said this in other videos as well, but you really need to utilize the flag function. The time pressure picks up in level 2 versus level 1, so it's going to need a more effective strategy, as well as reading the question then reading the vignette. You also don't want to waste too much time, so if you read the question, you read the vignette and you can't find the answer, well, move on, flag, move, and try and get through 50-60% of the exam first, and then come back and run through it again and do the same thing, and try and get 80% of the exam done, and then the last part of the exam can be spent on the last 10-20% of the questions. So that wraps it up. The top 5 tips were: start early, start with the hardest topic, understand formulas, learning techniques, and exam techniques. And if you cover off all of these things, you can do really well in the exam. Okay, if you like this video, hit like and subscribe for more content like this moving forward. I'll make something similar for level 3 soon. And otherwise, thank you and see you in the next video.